Here we are at the beginning of the second experimental reading comprehension section of LSAT PrepTest 141 over at LawHub LSAC.org. And as always, we're going to think about how we're going to engage with the passages first. So we'll go to questions. And you can see we start with two 7-question passages. And you're going to want to start with one of the two assumed to be easier passages as your first passage to engage with. And when you have a tie between the number of questions in those first two passages, you can pretty much just go with whatever content area you prefer. So you might note terms like DNA and RNA here immediately. Those are going to indicate that this is our science passage. You might click to question 8 and you see we're talking about a choreographer. That's going to indicate our humanities passage. So it's really at your discretion. But for the purposes of this video, we'll just start with the very first passage and question 1. And we should know that we have to engage with an upfront read for any reading comprehension passage on the LSAT. It's just going to be too difficult to understand the rather complex concepts that are in that passage without committing to the upfront read. So we're not going to read the question at all. We're going to go straight to the passage only view. And we're going to select one of our highlighter colors. Today, apparently, I'm picking orange. So what we're going to do now is we're going to read each individual paragraph. Obviously, you don't need to do it aloud. I will do it for the purposes of this video aloud, but you will go probably more quickly than I will here. But after having read the paragraph in full, you're going to stop and identify the 1 or 2 sentences that capture the main idea of that paragraph best, largely capturing whatever the author's argument is about the subject matter, and then repeat that process through the remainder of the paragraphs until you get to the end of the passage and are able to hopefully read only your highlighted sentences back to understand the overall main idea narrative of the passage, even if you're not necessarily familiar with whatever this passage is going to tell us about DNA and or RNA. So we have the highlight tool ready to go. We're going to read from the top. An organism is considered to have an infection when a disease-causing agent called a pathogen establishes a viable presence in the organism. This can occur only if the pathogenic agent is able to reproduce itself in the host organism, the only agents believed until recently to be responsible for infections. Viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites reproduce and regulate their other life processes by means of genetic material composed of nucleic acid, DNA, or RNA. It was thus widely assumed that all pathogens contain such genetic material in their cellular structure. And understanding that we are ultimately dealing with the LSAT, anything that involves the word assumed is very often going to be important, and I would say that this sentence certainly is the most important one of the entire paragraph, as we're taking into account the ideas that we're going to furthermore evaluate, imagining this idea about pathogens not containing genetic material, I'm guessing is coming, because why else would we say it was widely assumed? The thing you have to beware of and guard against with the introductory paragraph, especially for many people with the science section, is going and highlighting the background information just so you can understand it. We don't really care about the background information, though. We need to know what led to this assumption, and it was this idea that the only agents believed until recently believed until recently to be responsible for infections was that list, and that was because they reproduce and regulate their processes by means of their other life processes by means of genetic material. So it's because of this relationship that it was widely assumed that all pathogens contained genetic material. So the background information, the first 2 sentences, what is the definition of a pathogen and how it works, really shouldn't be highlighted in our main idea highlight color. If you feel you need to know what a pathogen is, just highlight called a pathogen here and know that's the definition that you can come get for your own information. But we're clearly coming into this subject matter as a reader, theoretically, already understanding some of this background information, because it's going to go into a more nuanced discussion here through the remaining paragraphs. But we'll grab our orange highlight tool back as we engage with the second paragraph. This assumption has been challenged, however, by scientists seeking to identify the pathogen that causes, I'm just going to call that CJD because I don't want to try to pronounce that first name with a C. A degenerative form of dementia in humans, CJD causes the brain to become riddled with tiny holes like a sponge, evidence of extensive nerve cell death. Its symptoms include impaired muscle control, loss of mental acuity, memory loss, and chronic insomnia. Extensive experiments aimed at identifying the pathogen responsible for CJD have led surprisingly to the isolation of a disease agent lacking nucleic acid and consisting mainly, if not exclusively, of protein. Researchers coined the term prion for this new type of protein pathogen. So again, that final sentence may seem to be defining, but it's really more semantic in nature. And if anything, I might go back to my little yellow here and just go, well, a prion is defined right here if I forget what that means in context. But the biggest most important piece of information for any of these sentences is that this CJD pathogen lacks the protein, which is coming from the DNA or RNA. And so that's how the assumption was challenged. So we'll probably also want to highlight this introductory sentence of this paragraph so we can connect the ideas in the second highlighted sentence of this second paragraph to the information and that wide assumption that apparently is wrong we identified in the first paragraph. Moving on to the next paragraph. Upon further study, scientists discovered that prions normally exist as harmless cellular proteins in many of the body's tissues, including white blood cells and nerve cells in the brain. However, they possess the capability of converting their structures into a dangerous abnormal shape. Prions exhibiting this abnormal conformation were found to have infectious properties and the ability to reproduce themselves in an unexpected way by initiating a chain reaction that induces normally shaped prions to transform themselves on contact one after another into the abnormal pathogenic conformation. This cascade of transformations produces a plaque consisting of thread-like structures that collects in the brain and ultimately destroys nerve cells. Because prions, unlike other pathogens, occur naturally in the body as proteins, the body does not produce an immune response when they are present. And in the absence of any effective therapy for preventing the cascade process by which affected prions reproduce themselves, CJD is inevitably fatal, though there are wide variations in pre-symptomatic incubation times and in how aggressively the disease progresses. So we discover that these prions in this topic sentence for this sentence are able to become a dangerous abnormal shape. And when they become abnormal, they end up creating this pathogenic issue. And then we just kind of get the details about why this is so bad. If you wanted to switch out the second highlighted sentence with one of these other ones towards the end, you probably could, but I just need to limit myself so that I'm not getting bogged down in detail. But we should understand that these prions, these non-DNA or RNA genetic material way of, having a pathogen become part of your body are bad. So the next page, we've got, although the discovery of the link between prions and CJD was initially received with great skepticism in the scientific community, subsequent research has supported the conclusion that prions are an entirely new class of infectious pathogens. That seems pretty important, but we'll highlight at the end as always. Furthermore, it is now believed that a similar process of protein malformation may be involved in other more common degenerative neurological conditions such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. This possibility has yet to be fully explored, however, and the exact mechanisms by which prions reproduce themselves and cause cellular destruction have yet to be completely understood. So, we'd probably just highlight these two sentences here, and we've got an overall understanding, hopefully, and probably have a somewhat limited, at least broad, comprehension of what is happening in real life as well. We've discovered what's causing these mental deterioration diseases basically, and it wasn't what we thought. So now that we've highlighted everything that we need from our main idea highlights in the various paragraphs, we want to read them through to confirm that we understand the overall narrative. The only agents believed until recently to be responsible for infections, viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites reproduce and regulate their other processes by means of genetic material composed of nucleic acid, DNA, or RNA. It was thus widely assumed that all pathogens contain such genetic material in their cellular structure. This assumption has been challenged, however, by scientists seeking to identify the pathogen that causes CJD, a degenerative form of dementia in humans. Extensive experiments aimed at identifying the pathogen responsible for CJD have led surprisingly to the isolation of a disease agent lacking nucleic acid and consisting mainly, if not exclusively, of protein. Upon further study, scientists discovered that prions normally exist as harmless cellular proteins in many of the body's tissues, including white blood cells and nerve cells in the brain. However, they possess the capability of converting their structures into a dangerous abnormal shape. Prions exhibiting this abnormal conformation were found to have infectious properties and the ability to reproduce themselves in an unexpected way by initiating a chain reaction that induces normally shaped prions to transform themselves on contact one after another into the abnormal pathogenic conformation. Although the discovery of the link between prions and CJD was initially received with great skepticism in the scientific community, subsequent research has supported the conclusion that prions are an entirely new class of infectious pathogens. Furthermore, it is now believed that a similar process of protein malformation may be involved in other more common degenerative neurological conditions such as Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. I think we've got the overall narrative, so now we can bring in the passage with question view. And we'll address question 1, which, as is the case in so many instances, is asking about the main point. So we really shouldn't need to reread anything else. We should know the main idea and be able to identify reasons to eliminate as we go through. So starting with choice A, although most organisms are known to produce several kinds of proteins, the mechanism by which isolated protein molecules such as prions reproduce themselves is not yet known in detail. Several reasons we might be able to eliminate this. First, most organisms, we're just talking more about the pathogens. So most organisms, and again, several kinds of proteins, we're really only talking about the prion, which is that thing that's a protein pathogen. So we've got a couple of reasons to eliminate choice A. Also, it's not that they're not yet known in detail, even though we don't know it in detail. If we read through that final paragraph, it's certainly not the main idea. Don't overthink it. Find one reason you can eliminate A. Then choice B, research into the cause of CJD has uncovered a deadly class of protein pathogens uniquely capable of reproducing themselves without genetic material. Well, this seems pretty darn good because that deadly class of protein pathogens is going to be the prions, and they do seem to be reducing themselves without genetic material. If you're confident, go ahead and select B, but we'll go through the remaining answer choices first, mainly for the purposes of this video. Then choice C, recent research suggests that prions may be responsible not only for CJD, but for most other degenerative neurological conditions as well. Most other degenerative neurological conditions, although we talked about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, I believe, if we went all the way to the end. Yep, there we go, Parkinson's disease. That most other, though, is going to be extreme. We can eliminate C for that reason. Then choice D, the assertion that prions cause CJD has been received with great skepticism in the scientific community because it undermines a firmly entrenched view about the nature of pathogens. I don't know that it's been met with great skepticism. It seems like it's getting accepted, if not by the scientific community at large, certainly by this author. And undermines a firmly entrenched view. I don't know that that's firmly entrenched. I mean, it's widely assumed, but maybe people will change their mind. So a couple of reasons to eliminate choice D there. And then choice E, even though prions contain no genetic material, it has become clear that they are somehow capable of reproducing themselves. Well, we're not just concerned with how prions reproduce themselves. So this, again, it's kind of in the paragraphs, but it's certainly not the main point of the passage. And we probably would have selected our correct answer of B a little while ago on the actual practice section.